Hi everyone, ever since I posted my last video where I got the highest score in the world for A-level history, I went up the stage and received the award. People have been asking me for my notes. Now, I definitely think that I do a rather good work in terms of preserving those notes. I mean, I have the printed version or written version of my notes because previously I was a very caveman version of myself, so I've written down those notes. The problem with this is that if I wrote down my notes on paper, it means that I do not have a soft copy of those notes, and that's why I couldn't share my notes in PDF form. So I reckon, since this is a video that I wanted to film since a very long time ago, before I came to this university, I was thinking maybe I could share my notes, but I didn't have time because I was preparing my university stuff. But after coming to university, I once again put it off because, well, studies getting a bit busier. So I decided that I will film this video in my winter break. And now it's winter break, so I guess I shouldn't delay it further, and maybe I should share my notes with you now. So this video would be separated into 4 distinct sections because, well, there are 4 papers in history A levels. I will start with paper 1 and then 2, 3, 4. Before I begin the video, I want to clarify something. The first is that I did CAIE A levels, so that's Cambridge International A levels. So if you take the history from other exam boards like Edexcel or AQA or others, then I'm not sure how this video could be very relevant to you. But of course, you can listen to what I have to say and then make up your own mind. I'm pretty sure there are some topics the different exam boards have in common. So I did Cambridge International A levels. Because of that, we can also choose the electives that we want to write about. So for example, for paper 3, you can choose different topics like origin and causes of the First World War, or you can write about the Cold War or the Holocaust. Personally, I picked the origins and development of the Cold War. As for paper 1, the topic that will be asked will alternate between the sitting that you do. So maybe you took it in May, June, or in different years, the topics will be switched. So in my year, I did my A-level history in October 2023. My topic for paper 1 is about empires and the emergence of world power, which is the first chapter in our textbook. So we use the blue textbook. If you want to know the books that I've used for each paper, you could check out one of my previous videos. I'm pretty sure I made one talking about the books I've used. But in this video, we will not talk about the course book because I'm pretty sure you already have it. But I want to talk specifically about what I distilled down from those course books. I mean, the course books are very long, but after you've written down those notes, it becomes a lot easier for you to digest all the information. As for paper 2, the topics tested will be the other 3 topics from the course book. So paper 1 and 2 are obviously AS papers, so you do it in the first year of your college. Now, for paper 2, I did the League of Nations in the 1920s and the League of Nations in the 1930s. The 4th chapter would be China and Japan, and of course, those questions are tested. But because you get to pick 2 topics to talk about from those 3, I decided not to talk about China and Japan because that was one of the topics which I find a lot more difficult to digest and also contains more information. So I did the League of Nations topics. So let us begin. I want to talk about paper 1 and 2 first. Now, I just mentioned that the topic for my paper 1 is empires and the emergence of world powers. So what I did was I've written down a very long list of the important timelines. So for example, I have the Japan timeline. So couldn't quite remember, it was a year ago, but if you look through the course book, you could see that one very important subtopic would be about Japanese history and another subtopic would be about the history of the USA. I've written down all the important years where important events happened. I also did the same for the USA. Those are the timeline. Of course, I've written it down on paper, so I wouldn't have to soft copy. Maybe at one point in the future, I would try to scan these documents and make them available in PDF form. And I guess that would be of huge help for those of you who need it. But I think in terms of a general strategy point of view, by writing this down, all these important years down in ascending order, you could very easily do your revision. Since you've already organized and listed down the important events, it takes less time to do revision as opposed to looking back at the course book and doing a revision again. Besides Japan and the USA, I also did one for international important years. Those include mainly European countries like the Berlin Conference and then how they occupy African territories from the 19th century to the 20th century. And this also includes what happened in China and in Africa as well. So something I've done which I find very useful is writing these timelines down because timelines is generally a very good way to revise for history. So that's the timeline. And the second thing I did, which was also very helpful, is I've printed out a map of Africa. You can find this readily available on the internet. This is only for the first topic topic, which is empires and the emergence of world power. So you can see that how the European countries divided Africa into their own sphere of influence. The reason I did this was because sometimes the name of certain African colonies are very difficult to memorize. So once I printed this out, I could do some marking and to identify which African region belonged to which European countries. So this is also something I find quite useful. And if you want to revise for the first empire chapters, it would also be quite useful to have something printed out like this. And the third note I had is the structure. I'm pretty sure I did a structure note for both paper 1 and paper 2. And if you look at this note, I'm going to show you. I've actually typed it down. So I had a PDF form for this. But ever since I came to Taiwan, I switched to a new electronic device. So I'm not completely sure whether I still have the original PDF document. But this is basically a note I distilled from looking at those specimen answer papers and how they structure their paper 1 essays. So I have one for paper 1 and another for paper 2, but I want to talk about the general overriding message which I've written down on this paper. So for history paper 1, because the time you have is less, you shouldn't repeat what you say, and also you are required to read 2 different sources and write down 2 essays with well-developed source evaluation in a very short period of time. So you want to make sure that you adopt a structure that will allow you to insert as much information as you can within a short period of time. So I think that's the direction, the mindset that you should adopt when you write your paper 1 essay. And I looked through my notes and I couldn't find the one for paper 2. So that's a huge shame because I couldn't quite remember. Of course, unless I got back and searched through my original files. But I hope this is useful for you. So definitely have some idea as to how you should structure your essay. Like maybe you can skip conclusion or introduction paragraph. I mean, I'm not sure whether this is always advisable. At least that's what I did. But basically the whole idea is try to save time and include as much information as you can. That's for paper 1 and 2. Now I want to talk about paper 3, which was the paper that I did surprisingly well. Now out of those 4 papers, I did the best for paper 3. And as I mentioned before, I talked about the Cold War. And this was all the more surprising because I spent actually the least amount of time on paper 3 because of the lack of information. Now, I say lack of information, it's not because of the lack of the Soviet archives. Of course, we have that. And there are also very good documents being written which are very helpful. But history A2, I feel, requires more independent research, and you need to find more information on the internet to help you write a better essay. So I think the difficulty is definitely there. And I feel history A2 is the real reason why some people feel history is a very difficult subject to learn. You know, those independent research is very time consuming, of course, and also you need to make sure that you research into the right direction. But thank goodness I've done the right thing and I'm here to share my notes. So if you're also doing origins and development of the Cold War, I think the first and foremost step is to try to have the scheme of work printed out. I have this scheme of work for every paper I did. So I have the syllabus printed out. Of course, syllabus is very important, but not as important as the scheme of work. So this is for paper 3. And this is for paper 4. Now, where do I get this scheme of work? I got them from the history teacher at my previous college. Now, of course, I didn't do my history paper at my previous college because at the time I already graduated. Before I graduated, I went and talked to the history teacher and he was very kind. He gave me a bunch of resources which are extremely helpful. I hadn't got a chance to thank him in person, but I talked to one of my juniors and requested for him to thank this history teacher. So I'm extremely grateful. And so I'm not sure whether this scheme of work would be available online, but these are very helpful because basically they show you all the information that you require for doing the exam. This is especially helpful for paper 3, which is a bit more weight than the other papers. So let's talk about my notes then. Now, firstly, I have a book called The Origins of the Cold War by Martin Macaulay, and the specific pages which I've taken down was page 3 to page 29. Now, this was the part the previous history teacher find especially useful. Now, of course, it was very unfortunate because at that time at my college, there was a period of time where we hadn't had a good history teacher. It was until later that a new history teacher came Then he left and another new history teacher came. So in my batch of students, I'm pretty sure the majority of students who took A-level history didn't perform very good because of the change in teacher. But let's not deviate from the topic. The first information I got was this. Now all of these notes, I mean the printed notes and also the books, the course books I've used, I have gotten them from my college friends. So because they have no use for it anymore, they've taken a paper and I asked them, could I have those? And they say, sure, you can have this. And therefore I have so much information which helped me a lot. So once again, I want to say thank you. If one of my previous college friends are watching this, thank you very much. So the first book was The Origins of the Cold War, and the name I've already mentioned, Origins of the Cold War by Martin McCauley. And the second book was, surprisingly, the IGCSE course book. Who would have thought? Because IGCSE, I guess you could imagine that the content is a lot more easier than A-levels, and that's true. So the name of the book is called The 20th Century History, International Relations since 1919 by Tony McLeavy. So the part of the course book which I've taken for Cold War was page 94 to 121. Let me talk about the content of these notes. Let's talk about the origins of the Cold War first. So it basically gives a very brief introduction of the different interpretations of what caused the Cold War. There were different schools of thoughts, the revisionists, post-revisionists, and many others. Basically, it gives a very brief review of each, and also some context and background information of what happened that gave rise to those thoughts, and also an introduction of the background of those who devised these thoughts. Like for example, like Cannon. Yep, I remember Cannon. Okay, and also many others. It was a long time ago. This IGCSE course book, of course, is a lot easier and it contains simpler information like the Berlin blockade and the Iron Curtain and what happened at the Yalta and Potsdam conference, how the feeling was like, and the tension in international relations. So both information are very useful for my history paper 3. And another piece of text which I found very useful was the specimen paper answers, which is also available online. And by reading the specimen paper answers, you'll find out how to identify different elements in the historical extract. So those are the two important documents, and let us move on to paper 4. So for paper 4, I think there were 4 different topics. The first was Stalin's Russia, and then Hitler's Germany, and Mussolini's Italy, and also a wartime Britain topic. Now, by wartime Britain, I think it was after the First World War until the beginning of the Second World War. Personally, I took Stalin's Russia and Hitler's Germany. I picked those two because I had the most resources devoted to these topics, because these two topics were also what my friends took back in college. I reckon if I also did those two, I would have more information and more resources from them. So let me share my notes. Now, the first note I had, which I found enough reason to make, was the life in Stalinist Russia topic. Now, basically it talks about how Stalinist policies affect women and families in Russia, and also how it affects children, so all the vulnerable groups. And it also talks about Stalin's policy towards non-Russian minorities. Of course, that includes collectivization and also the purges during 1936 to 1939, and also the impact of economic changes on workers. There was also another section about the impact of the use of propaganda and the use of the personality cult that helped solidify Stalin's power. And out of all these important subsections, I want to give specific mention to the impact of Stalin's policy on non-Russian nationalities. The reason it deserves mention is that the information here was actually not from the course book. I went out of the way researching on the internet about the impact of Stalin's policy and how they affect the non-Russian minorities, like for example the Volga Germans, and also the Kazakhs, Kalmyks, Chechens, and different subgroups. And the reason I did that was because I looked through the scheme of work I just mentioned, and I found out that it was actually one piece of information that was required to do the exam. So I went out of my way to search for this information. And I must say that process was really quite gruesome. I guess most of the information you could already find from the course book, but it helps to have a scheme of work which shows you in what direction do you still need to improve and what information you might have missed. And so the first note I had was life in Stalinist Russia. The second one was taken, I think, exactly in the original form from the course book, and that is the timeline of what happened in Stalin's Russia. So it's like a fact sheet, really. So firstly, I have a timeline from 1997 after the October Revolution until 1953 when the Doctors' Plot, which was an anti-Jewish plot started by Stalin. So the timeline was really rather packed, and it was also very useful information. Afterwards, I also made some notes on how Stalin rose to power. So initially, they talk about the structure of the Bolshevik government and the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. So Politburo and Orgbureau, and afterwards talk about how Stalin began his political career up until 1924. And basically, he was very humble during the early days of his political career. He was robbing banks, etc. And afterwards, he defeated the more left portion of the party, like Trotsky and his notion of permanent revolution. And afterwards, a few more mention about the important factors which allowed Stalin to come to power. So that's the fact sheet which I made. Of course, this is also printed out, and therefore I might have the original PDF form. Maybe I could try to search it out, and if I found out, I am also going to give this out in PDF form for free. And another note I had was Russia before Stalin's rule. So it talks about the Lenin's legacy and what he has created. Now the reason I did this is because it's part of the syllabus, and we are also required to know this. Of course, I have another completely different book which was dedicated to the description of how Russia was like under communist rule in the early days before Stalin. I also read the book, but it was after I finished my history exam. But it is still relevant for the exam to a certain extent, so I also have something written down of what Lenin has created in Russia. So that includes authoritarianism, politicizing of the law, and the setup of concentration camps for political opponents, and these are also all very important factors. And also something quite important was the fight, or should I say the conflict between the concept of war communism and the new economic policy. Now the new economic policy was pushed by Lenin because there was a time they pushed very fierce collectivization in the early days in Soviet Russia, and afterwards some part of the party, including Lenin himself, has decided maybe they want to release a bit of central economic control and to slow down the pace of collectivization, and that has created a kind of hidden split in the party, and that way it has allowed Stalin to thrive. And later there was the conflict in the notion between permanent revolution and socialism in one country. Now permanent revolution was pushed forward by Trotsky, and socialism in one country was pushed forward by Stalin, of course, and afterwards Stalin won because he was a bit smarter in the maneuvering and the gaining of party support. So there's another piece of note which I made, which involves the earlier days. All these are for Stalin's Russia. Another topic which I did was Hitler's Germany, and I'm pretty sure I also made notes for the study of that topic, but I'm not sure why I couldn't find those notes. But I have a printed one, which I don't know where it came from. I'm pretty sure I got it from one of my friends, which includes all the important information of what happened in Hitler's Germany. Like there was one page about the police state, like the Gestapo, SS, and concentration camps, the Enabling Act, and also how they use propaganda, the Nazis' relationship with the church, women in Nazi Germany, and Hitler's youth. I think this note was also quite good. I'm pretty sure they include very few information. I mean, maybe moderate, or maybe a bit less than moderate, but I guess this could also be a bit useful. I think I rarely use this during my exam, but now that I look at it, I feel that it's really okay. And it's also quite a thin note, so maybe I've read it. I don't remember it was, but I think it's quite good. Alright, so I have talked about all the notes I have, and these are really the notes I have. I'm quite sure that there are some notes which I haven't printed out in paper form, and they exist in PDF form in my previous laptop. But obviously we couldn't recover those, or maybe we could at one point in the future, but these are notes I have. But what I hope is, by this video, it gives you some idea as to how you should revise for A-level history. I mean, this subject always attracted polarizing opinions. Some people found it extremely difficult, but for me, I think if you adopt the proper mindset and a proper approach towards the revision of these chapters, you could see very good progress. Personally, I did my A-level history within 4 to 5 months and also received an A-star for the subject. So I think a very huge part of it boils down to the passion you have for the subject, the way you organize your notes, and the method which you use for your history revision. So I hope this video helped. If you have further questions, feel free to comment in the section below, and we will see in the next video. Bye!